Hoodoo plant mamas, get your soul fed and your spirit read.
This here ain't no trend. I possess the power from way back when. Back when folk were stripped from all of their kin, so they had to find the magic within. So I call on my ancestors to gather my herbs. I conjure at my altar. Voodoo plant mama. I manifest growth and I release trauma.
Child, we just out here trying to water our plants and mind our business, you know? Everybody ain't from the deep south, man. Everybody can't have culture like us.
Hey y'all, and welcome back to another episode of Hoodoo Plant Mamas. I am your co-host, Leah Nicole.
And I'm Dani B.
And today we are joined by Austen Smith. Austen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Austen, pronouns they, them, and I'm happy to be here.
Well, we're happy that you're here. Before we get into the episode, we usually do like a quick check-in. How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling rested and like I could use more rest.
What about you, Leah?
I'm actually doing pretty good. So as I was preparing for the show, I used Austen's Imagination Doula principles and it helped me through one of my projects. So I'm super excited to talk to you today
I love that.
about
I
it.
love that. Yeah.
How are you, Dani?
I'm doing okay as well. I feel like I also feel pretty rested. Yeah, so I'm doing good. Well, let's get into some gratitude. So I'll start with you, Leah. What are you thankful for today?
I just want to say I'm super thankful for the students in Mississippi who have been standing up against their universities and standing up against the government. Like, I am so proud of them and I just wish them well.
What about you, Austen?
I am grateful for the presence of the ancestors who are behind the scenes making everything shake. Very into that.
I am thankful for the ancestors who I believe are with all Black people who take a stand in the name of like protecting the humanity of oppressed people. Like, I went on a rant yesterday, I think, on my close friends about like what Black Mississippians are up against, what Black and brown Mississippians are up against, and just the fact that like they don't get those same eyes as other places around the world when they do this. And so it's especially dangerous. So I'm just like thankful that in spite of that, there are still young Black Mississippians that like refuse to be silenced. And I'm thankful for the ancestors that are protecting them. So yeah, I've probably said this to both of y'all, but like as I've began to write more about my childhood and sort of like, you know, as you're writing about it, memories start coming back. And I've been reminded how like daydreaming has been an intricate part of my existence, still is. And I think it's been sort of like a survival mechanism or like my body's natural response to distress, which is why like if I'm in a work meeting, shout out to Minda because this is why I be asking her stuff that she said already. Sometimes
She told me to tell you how.
Sometimes in the meeting, and it's not on purpose, even in conversation with people, I will literally like my brain will divest, literally fall into something else, into a thought, into like a daydream, like a memory that maybe did or didn't happen. So like a memory that my brain has just created. But there are other times, even now, that I do it just for fun. So I'm interested in hearing, what is your earliest memory of daydreaming?
My earliest memories of daydreaming, I think, have to do with reading. I was a kid who was always in a book. In that way, books were sort of this guided meditation process of being in some other world, in some other place, in a way that's sustained and full of detail. I remember I used to have these daydreams once I started to read and read often. I was always reading, that I started to learn how to do that on my own, that I didn't need a book to go somewhere. And I would often just daydream about being in nature. It was never something like over the top. it was just like, oh, I want to be on some land with some weeping willows brushing up against my skin in the sun, you know? And I could be there for hours. I could be there for hours. Just being in that place, birds coming by to visit, you know, just laying in the grass or being in a meadow full of flowers. I think there's this longing for place. Um, I was never in a city when I was daydreaming. I was never in an office, you know, like with a city view. I was never in a big old house. I was always free of that. And so, I mean, gosh, that those had to have been my earliest memories were daydreams.
What about you, Leah?
So this is going to sound really depressing, but I think when I think of my absolute earliest memories of daydreaming, for a lot of it, it was me wishing that I could be someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And it was because I was bullied like a lot as a child, like from 4 to 6. And I just remember thinking, like, oh, if I was one of the popular girls or if I was super pretty, people wouldn't make fun of me anymore. And so I would imagine like what life would be like if I was one of them. And I think from there it developed into like, what would my life be like if I was blank? And it was a way for me to get through. And then I think eventually that developed into me like writing stories about like, ooh, if my life was like this, it would be like da 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 da.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a sad beginning, but I have made use of it.
Mm-hmm. I just want to say my same, like a lot of my reading and time spent away was an effort to escape a certain type of reality.
Hmm.
And so it did come from that place of like, I need to be somewhere else. I want to be somewhere else.
Yeah.
um, and finding those somewhere else's in books, movies, and all kinds of stuff. So I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to say that resonates with me.
I did a lot of that more into my preteens and teens with wishing that I was like, daydreaming about being thin or daydreaming about
Mm,
having long hair, all the things that was considered pretty. But my childhood daydreams were extremely whimsical. My grandma had me a whole like short story collection of like the princess fairy tales, and that was
mm,
my jam. Like, I don't know what it was, but I loved all that like magical stuff. So
mm,
child, I could be daydreaming about being like a bird or I don't know, being like a princess in a castle. Like it was just actually ridiculous. That was what my daydreams were,
I
like
love that.
very like mystical and all that.
So when I was younger, my mama used to always say, like, if you can imagine or dream it, it can exist. And I don't know why, but I always thought like when she said that it meant the worst things imaginable. And like
Mm,
as a child, I struggle a lot with like compulsive thoughts. And so I was thinking vampires, I was thinking serial killers, like rapists, all of these disturbing and distressing things were imaginable. And only that, like, it's only now as an adult that I'm starting to see like the other side of things, like the best things in the world are possible.
mm,
But it's interesting that when I say good things are possible, there's more pushback than if I say bad things are possible. Even when we talk about the end of the world, everyone can only imagine it as death and destruction.
mm-hmm,
Like they can't imagine anything better. And I think that creates this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where we only feed into the worst things possible
mm-hmm,
because you believe it's going to happen, and so you sort of make it happen. And so related to this, like I've noticed a trend in our movies where like modern day movies are either set in 2019 or they're set way in the past or they're set in some like dystopian future. They're
mm-hmm,
not really set in the present, or at least the TV shows I watched. If they did talk about COVID, it was very quickly and they moved
mm-hmm,
past.
mm-hmm,
And so I'm thinking about like what this means for our collective imagination when we refuse to address what's going on right now, when we only ever want to live in 2019 and forget the 2020s even exist. We're almost halfway through the decade.
mm-hmm,
And so I'm wondering if you've noticed something similar in terms of our collective imagining of the worst,
mm-hmm.
and what that could mean about us as a society.
The first thing that comes to mind is I've been in a conversation with what the imagination means for quite some time. And I have noticed sort of the thread between whatever it is you dream, that it is possible and it can become possible. You can manifest that in all of the different directions that can go. And I think that the collective imagination is functioning as it should. And what I mean by that is that the imagination itself is a colonial construct. We actually need to move out of the imagination and into our indigenous ways of dreaming and knowing and connecting, that I think is outside of what we are calling imagining. Like, I think there is a difference between to imagine something and to dream it. I think what happens in the collective imagination is that it is still living out a colonial fantasy. There's no way around that. As long as we're functioning within the concept of an imagination without redefining it or collectively taking it and being intentional about shaping it into our own thing, I think it will always be something that is connected to coloniality and white supremacy and colonialism. So the collective imagination is functioning the way it should because the imagination itself, I think, is a part of the system. Like, it is a manufactured, like a plastic god, like a manufactured deity that holds whatever fantasies that colonialism can come up with, while also allowing colonizers to take full credit for the things that are happening in the world, to copyright the earth's wisdom, right? And to do that without ever crediting the spirits, the ancestors, the nature deities who are actually the architects of this design. And so I think collectively we should start by defining what is a collective and what does that mean. I think in our desire for something whole and sacred, that we bypass the tedious work of getting to know each other, deciding if we want to share a dream together. Are we dreaming the same dream? um, and so often we're not. And that's okay. I think the thing that the imagination is trying to copy, that place, whatever the name of it is, that place has the capacity for all of us to dream different dreams and being that together. The imagination doesn't. And so it's funny because I named my project the Imagination Doulas and then later learned that the imagination is not even where it's at. I think all that to say is that it makes sense then that the collective imagination is in a loop, in a time loop that is fueled by colonial fantasies and desires. And that so long as we're in that loop, so long as we're in a conversation with the imagination and within the imagination, I think there are limitations about what we can do together and individually.
The way you sort of conceptualize imagination with it as a like colonial construct, I do think it's similar to like conversations Leah and I have had on this podcast about like how our imaginations are being limited. And I actually think the way you define it makes it make more
Mm,
sense, because that limitation is why we only can think like dystopian.
mm-hmm,
And it wasn't until just now with this question, Leah, that I thought about that. Like what would it mean to daydream about the end of the world and it be something beautiful? Like,
mm-hmm,
and I don't think any of us, I can't speak for everybody else, but I can speak for myself, is that I have never imagined the end of the world being beautiful. I have never had the capacity to like come up with something that could make sense based on like where we are, like the conditions we're living under, especially
mm-hmm,
now as we're witnessing a genocide and we're witnessing like this heavy handedness against people who are saying like, we see what's happening. Like, why are y'all trying to like convince us that what we see isn't what's happening?
mm-hmm,
And so, yeah, I actually think that's like a really effective way to describe it, because that's kind of like what we have been talking about like that particular limitation that's been like
Mhm.
put on us. That makes sense.
As you were talking, I was I think for me when I dream of something after the end of the world. Like I don't dream of
Mm.
just blackness. I dream of like there's going to be some uncomfortable violent times, but there will be something after that. And
Mhm.
so that's what I'm dreaming of. I think of like Octavia Butler. I want to say it was Parable of the Talents, where Lauren, the main character, was like, "I intend to survive," and it's like, I don't care what's going on.
Mhm.
I intend to make it to the other side of the end of the world.
Right. And like I think for me, my concept of the end of the world comes from Revelations. And so of course it's not pretty, but also thinking about not just like who authored that, um, but also like what were the conditions that led to that authoring of that type of end of the world, and end of the world that can only be violent. And when I went back and read the book of Revelations as an adult, it did not scare me as much as it did when I was a child. Anything that happened growing up was a testament to the end of times in my family. Everything. And so it's like, oh, this is the end of days. And that was the justification for all things wild and all things that didn't make sense. When I look at the sort of symptoms of the end of the world in Revelations, the symptoms illustrate a world where oppression is fracturing, like it's breaking down. Gender is breaking down. Dominance over children in a particular way, child oppression is breaking down, and children are fighting back against their elders who misled them. That people are being more gender expansive and they're not willing to be confined by these constructs. We see all of this happening right now, and when I was younger, I had no idea that I was trans, because transness for me is a response to the oppression. It's not necessarily some like inherent identity, so much as it's a dialogue. It's like, oh, like this is who I show up as in conditions that are not supportive of me, and all that I am. But it didn't pass me like that my gender had changed, and I was like, oh, that's in Revelations. And so even then, as I'm like, doing the work of self-liberation, spiritual liberation, that's still in the back of my mind. That's how deeply indoctrinated I am with the end of the world being associated with violence and death. And as we're seeing what's happening, as this genocide is being live streamed, what I'm seeing is that in order for any other world to exist, this one has to go. And in the process of it, because it does not want to go, this is a world that is obsessed with immortality, right? That like it is willing to take as many people down as it can in its own dying process. That end of the world is a world that we did not write. We don't even really connect with the afterlife in those ways. Like we understand it's a cycle, but when you orient to the world in a straight line, that ending is something that becomes a place of fear, and it becomes a place of deep avoidance. And so what we're seeing is a system that is avoiding its own death on its own linear timeline, because it didn't have to be this way. And like that in and of itself is creating, like you said, Leah, the self-fulfilling prophecy of the violence. And so it's like it's happening that way because that's what they imagine. But what are we dreaming about? This question around like what is after the end of the world? I think we're living in the after the end of the world of living in our own indigenous communities. Like we exist in the afterlife of that. We exist in the afterlife of chattel slavery. We exist in the afterlife of the genocide of the indigenous people and nations that stewarded this land in such a way that we are now on it and living on it. And like, so we're already in so many types of afterlives that for me, the question is not what happens after the end of this world, or even a question about worlds, so much as my question around, do we see that this is being engineered by other forces And can we collaborate with those forces to complete the engineering process of this new world? And what does that look like when people are actively dying en masse? And like, how do we reconcile with that while we're also striving toward this new iteration? And do we need to, are we the ones to make any of that up? Like, do we even need to strive? Or do we need to actually, let go of the reins, because so much of this is the result of striving. It's just wild to see the child in me that was so afraid of this seven-headed beast and all of this stuff and all of this fantastical Dungeons and Dragons and knights and slaying things, that like I was so afraid of that, terrified of that. It would keep me up at night. And now to see it in action and be like, well, thank God this world is ending. We needed to speed up. Like it needs to happen faster. While at the same time being like, and holy shit, look at the mess that it's making, because it will not die peacefully. And the grief that we're all taking on, and there's no way that we're going to have a new world without reckoning with this grief, the grief not of just what's happening now with the genocide of Palestinians, Sudanese people. Haiti is in its own reckonings, and the list goes on. But also, we never dealt with the pandemic with 2020. We never dealt with the millions of people that were killed because of the ignorance of the people who just like won't let something die. And so it's really costing us. And that's where I think the work of the healers comes in around, and how do we bear with that cost, the metaphorical cost, but also the literal cost, because we're also paying for this out of our pockets.
There's two things that came to mind, and there's two big things that could probably need to be a separate podcast conversation. The first one is this idea of us living in like different afterlives of things
Mm-hmm.
that have already happened. I feel like you have written about this, Leah, about, and Kiese has said something similar about how, like, for Black Mississippians specifically, the world has ended several times. I think for Black
Mm-hmm.
people, particularly in the Deep South, the world has ended several times. I mean, even if you think about like a singular event like Hurricane Katrina
Yeah.
and what was happening to Black people, that was like apocalyptic. Like what
Mm-hmm.
we imagine as apocalyptic, that is what was happening to families. And then the other thing that I think about is I want to use my words carefully. And I guess I can ask it as a question. What would it mean to define like the mass death of Black people during this pandemic as a genocide? Because it could have been prevented and because it was disproportionately affecting us. I know for a lot of people that could be really controversial, but when you really think about it, I don't know what was happening for other people, but
Mm-hmm.
it was like a chain reaction. I was dealing with like knowing family members where within a couple of weeks, several different people are dying in the hospital. Seven different people are suffocating to death from COVID. We saw articles of entire families being wiped out in the same house.
Yeah.
Like we are like sort of in the afterlife of that. And I don't think
Mm-hmm.
people really want to look at it that way because it feels like, well, that's not the same. Millions of people dying is not the same as that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. That's just what I thought about because I think people don't like to use strong language for certain things, but
Mm-hmm.
the strong language is actually appropriate when you consider what was happening. You had people literally refusing to
Yeah.
wear masks. You had people saying that basically it wasn't real.
I mean, that's happening now. Like, this is the pandemic never even ended, but we decided it somewhere along the line that like actually we've had enough of this.
Yeah.
So it just didn't happen, and it's not happening. And it's like,
Yeah.
wait a minute. Like, there's multiple variants that have, I mean, it's just pretty wild. But what I hear you saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that genocide happens at different paces. that like there are genocides that take place and take pace at the rate that it's happening, that we're seeing online with Palestinians. But then there's like a slow genocide. And that genocide is, I mean, I think the pandemic was a different pace, and all, like, to me that was very fast and it was sudden. And it was a result of people in power who knew what the implications were, because I believe the person who discovered COVID also died of COVID before he could like make the announcement. And when he did inform people, the response to it was a lack of urgency. And on some level, you can't not know that that's going to impact millions of people. And so I would be interested in a conversation around like what gets defined as a genocide. And I think it could be, and expanding genocide to be something that happens at different paces, because the murdering of indigenous people took a long time, and it was a long time, and it happened over a stretch of time. And so in thinking about that, the expansiveness of genocide, I think what is possible is that people might see that it is impacting them in a direct way, that it's not something that's happening over there, that actually, oh shit, this has been happening to all of my loved ones. And like it's gonna happen to me too if I don't do something about it. And I think that, like, what my family would call like lighting a fire under somebody's ass, might be what's needed for people to be able to see that connection, that it's personal, it's a very personal thing. And it's personal even if you decide that it doesn't exist, like you can decide that a virus isn't out there and go outside and you still can catch it, so like you could still catch it. So I think like this conversation around genocide having multiple paces is interesting to me, because there's a way that like the devastation of what's happened to Black people across the diaspora still has not really been named.
Mhm.
And this is the last thing I'm going to say, and I think this is a separate podcast episode. I have been thinking about this for a while, and I'm glad y'all had a good reaction, because I've actually been scared to say it out loud. Because when we think about the fact that, like, enslaved people, particularly in the South, used to outnumber the like amount of white people, and then that changed. How do you define that? And then how do you define like once slavery ends and you have hundreds, thousands of Black people being lynched, and then you have police brutality? Like, talking about it as like this slow process, the fact that you
Mhm.
can whittle down a population that once outnumbered you to being the minority in the blackest region of this country, I don't think people think about that in a way. And I think that because they don't think about that in a way, and I'm specifically talking about Black people, I think the ones that are still reluctant to see themselves in Palestinians, like, I think if
Mhm.
they thought about the fact that like you have lived through this over a period of time, then maybe they would see that like this struggle is also our struggle. You know what I mean? So, but I'll get off my tangent. We can make that a podcast episode.
I do want to add something about what you said, because I do remember early pandemic. I want to say it was late April when the headlines were coming out about Black people were disproportionately affected by COVID. It was like almost immediately people were like, get rid of the quarantines, get rid of
Yeah.
masks, get rid of everything. And that was like people were urging a state sanctioned violence. Like
Mhm.
I don't think calling it a genocide is unreasonable.
Well, we also just need new terms, right? Like I've been talking to someone, so to a couple of people about this recently, but this language is designed for commercial and industrial work. Like, this is not a language of love or intimacy or connection. And so there are certain nuances that are just not available. We have to create new words to really fully understand the scope of what is happening. And so, whether or not it's called a genocide, I think genocide is effective because people know what that means. But I also think that for me personally, I would be open to finding new words to describe intricacies of the violence that is taking place. That, like, if it is slowed down, like a reverb, like, when a song is like slowed and it's like a reverb, it's very like melodic and can be a completely different experience than the song at its regular pace. That if there's a word for that, then I think like we can really take it, build it out, expand it with evidence that is, I mean, it's bountiful. We have so much evidence of genocide taking place at different paces and different times. And how do we do that in a way that does not center what has happened to the exclusion of what is happening right now? Because I think that's where we can sometimes miss the opportunity to connect the thread of, oh, and this is happening right now to people in Palestine, to people in Sudan, to people in the Congo, to people in, like, we have to be able to do that part. And I think that's where people are like, yes, this did happen to us, but don't make that leap to, and so we should make sure and find ways to make sure it's not happening to other people. Because I don't think that we always see the ways that what's happening there will always circle back to what's happening here. We're seeing it now with the ways that the students who are protesting genocide on campus are being treated by militarized police forces that are intricately tied, along with institutions, to Israel and what's taking place. And so all that to say is like, this is what the colonial imagination is about. It will keep us in this loop and daydreaming and finding those other places, this like other dreamscape, and being there to figure out what beauty exists in this afterlife. I think will be really important to actually cultivating that beauty even in the present moment. It doesn't have to wait into some linear future that can start happening. It is happening even now. We're seeing solidarity. Possibilities are opening up in ways that like I don't think I ever thought was possible. So it's happening, and we have to take those and like fertilize them with all of our love and intention and energy and effort and resources, so that, you know, one day that's all that's happening is that.
Let's get into some ways you can support the Hoodoo Plant Mamas. One way is through our bookshop, where you can buy the books that we previously discussed. We have a Hoodoo Beginner's Guide. Leah and I share our top reading picks. And we have books from our Writing the Spirit series. Every purchase you make helps support our show. Check us out at bookshop.org/shop/Hoodoo Plant Mamas, or at the link in our show notes. Other ways you can support us include rating and reviewing this podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at Hoodoo Plants and Instagram at Hoodoo Plant Mamas.
Check out our Patreon, where we share exclusive video, plant, and spiritual content for only $3 a month. We have a new patron, Witness Elevation. Thank you for joining us. If you prefer a one-time donation, you can donate via Cashapp, #Hoodoo Plant Mamas, or our PayPal, hoodooplantmamas@gmail.com. Let's get back to the show. So we wanted to spend the second half of the show talking about imagination doulas and the principles behind it. So first, Austen, could you explain what imagination doulas is?
I will try. Imagination Doulas is a project that came to me, gosh, almost like 7-8 years ago. But I was so afraid of the responsibility of this project that I just got to the point of being able to do sort of laying the groundwork for this to be a thing. Part of that groundwork is to at least let other people know this is what I'm thinking about. The Imagination Doulas, the function of it is to create a space where Black people, brown people, and I'm even specific when I say brown people, because I know that's a blanket statement. And so what I will say is Black and Blackened people, people who are treated Black because of their proximity to Blackness, whether it be through skin color or through class. And that can be really expansive. But like how we are relating to our dreams. And so my like little spiel about the Imagination Doulas is basically it's a project that helps people to imagine beyond the limitations of white supremacy using ancestral and indigenous technologies. But now, with this newer understanding, because it's its own force, which is one of the principles, is that ideas have agency, and so it itself evolves. And so now it's thinking about exploring the dream space beyond the imagination and beyond white supremacy, and how to guide people to do that. I'm very careful not to say this is like a decolonizing the imagination. That is not what this is. Decolonizing, I think, is a different process. I think it may happen in the process of this work as a byproduct of this work, but it is not the focus. Nothing about colonization is the focus of this work. Even unbecoming of it is not a part of it. But there is a part of it that does talk about how we were taught to relate to the imagination, to time, to ancestry, to dreams, and to creativity. And so that's as clear. I'm so sorry if it's not. But if it is and it resonates with you, that's because you're on the frequency. If it doesn't, you can get there, but maybe through like a class or a daydreaming course or an event or something like that. Because I think some people want more hands on to really be able to be like, oh, I get it now because I was able to touch it and feel it. And so don't be discouraged. Just, keep following the process.
So I just kind of wanted to go through each principle and just have you explain it.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one is daydreaming as a creative discipline.
Daydreaming is, for me, the methodology that will, and there are many other methodologies, but is the methodology for me in this thought practice that can help us to strengthen our connections to this dream space, this collective dream space. Daydreaming is something that is shunned socially. When people are considered daydreamers, that's not a good thing. When someone calls you a dreamer or a daydreamer, that typically means, it's typically associated with like laziness or not wanting to work or not taking life seriously. All the things that are associated with being an artist and a creative as well. When you want to venture out into your path as a creative, you are met with the resistance of people who are conditioned to believe you cannot survive life that way. And so I think in that way, I'm taking daydreaming and I'm reclaiming it as an ancestral technology, because to daydream is to vision, is to have visions, is to see. And to me, that there's no, what does Tony K. Bambara say? Like, that's not a trifling matter. Like, that's something serious. And if I look at the way that white supremacy has downplayed all of our spiritual practices, and then later on we come back to it and we realize that it's a source of power, then I feel like those same minimizing tactics are used to reduce daydreaming to a waste of time, when actually that's a source of power, to be able to see and to train yourself to see through daydreaming. And so that's the discipline, is the training that happens when you take the time to cultivate a seeing practice, a way of being in this other realm where time folds in on itself. Linear time doesn't exist there. You can commune with your ancestors, with your descendants, even the people coming after you, to be like, what is it that we're doing together? That's the collective that we're actually referring to when we talk about the collective, is looking to your people. And your people don't have to be biological family members. This could be anybody who feels a part of your collective, your group, your people, your tribe, to be able to say, what is it that we are doing and how is it existing through me? And for them to say and give you advice and wisdom from different points of time, and to guide your process. That is the imagination we need to be in, not this other one. And so daydreaming then becomes sort of like endurance training of how to be in those visions, and how to hear and how to see and sense, and how to make sense of what is coming to you, to interpret that, and to rely on yourself as your own source of wisdom to say, oh, I saw a crow, that means I need to go give offerings to the lake or to the ocean. Or, oh, I saw this snail, I need to slow down, I'm moving too fast. Or seeing like, oh, I saw, purple drapery, okay, that's lavish, I'm into it. Like that means something else is coming here. Or even sometimes they'll show up and have words for you. Sometimes it's not humans, sometimes it's animals and nature deities that come to you and say, like, we're concerned about your health, we need you to slow down. And to really take that and embody it in your life, that's the discipline. Because we have visions all the time and we see it and we're like, oh yeah, it's a suggestion. And the cultivation of that discipline is to treat it not as a suggestion, but as like wisdom to be applied to your life, and to do that in a tangible way. To say, I'm sleeping, I'm going to bed at 9 now because I've been told that I actually need to rest or to avoid sickness. Or, oh, I'm actually I'm gonna splurge a little bit because I was told to like do that, Or, oh, I was told I need to talk to you, I need to talk to you about something. So I want to establish a relationship with you so that we can talk and see what happens out of that. You're following orders. You're following orders. And the practice is to learn how to follow those orders.
The second principle, which I've been thinking about a lot, is the world needs more culturally, emotionally, and spiritually responsible artists,
Mm-hmm.
or response able artists, or yeah, however that's supposed to be said. But it's had me thinking a lot about, you mentioned Tony K. Bombera, which is so funny because the question I had put down is, what do you think the role of the artist is during these times? Like before you
Yeah.
even said it. Because for me, it's been a struggle because I've been feeling like I'm not doing enough, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I'm supposed to be at protests. There's a lot of reasons I don't think I'm supposed to be at protests. One of them is that I am like a cat or a dog, meaning when I feel fear, sometimes my response is aggression. Like
Mm-hmm.
I could fuck up the whole thing. Like I can fuck up the whole thing. Like a white person come barking in my face. Now we're all fighting because now like that's my fear response. Like, you know what I mean? Like, and I also think my nervous system gets really unregulated at protests, like in a way that I
Mm-hmm.
can't control. Like it's just like, but I do feel like, okay, as a writer, as an artist, like what am I supposed to be doing? And it's just been like a
Mm-hmm.
really like point of contention for me, and it's caused a lot of guilt. So yeah, so for you in the context of this principle, like how do we become more culturally, emotionally, and spiritually responsible as we are witnessing like all these atrocities? And
Mm-hmm.
how you described it earlier, it is a cycle, like a cycle of atrocities. But right now, in this
Mm-hmm.
present moment, we're witnessing something very particular happen.
Mm-hmm. I think the most clear way that I can describe that principle is to know your role and do it well. We are in a time where I think that's more important than anything, and that the protest is not the only site of liberation, and that there are many different protests and forms of protest that are taking place. We were talking about human design a while back, and thinking about different designs, and thinking about how only 9% of the planet are manifestors. Like we have a very particular setup. And what's wild is that a lot, like several of my closest people are all manifestors. So I'm like, if there's only 9%, how did we all end up in this same energy? But either way, I use human design as an example because it identifies that everybody's set up differently. Even the people within the same types of design are set up differently. For example, as a manifester, I have an open root, an open sacral, an open solar plexus. I'm going to take in all the emotions, all of them, anywhere I go. Going to the grocery store is its own experience for me because I'll be excited about a recipe, and then 2 aisles later, I'm wondering why I suddenly have the urge to sob and don't know what's happening. And I'm like, oh, because I'm in public. That's why there's so much sadness in a grocery store. And in when I lived in Kentucky, that was even one of the tactics, was like to play emotional music so that people will buy more food. So I go in there and Whitney Houston is playing, and I'm sitting there like, ice cream, And so, but yeah, like the point is that we all have a different role to play. I think we lose steam when we spend a lot of time guilting ourselves into being in other roles or coveting other roles because they might be more flashy or more present or more legible. The healers know about this because nobody sees the healers. And the healers that are on the front line are special. I used to do that. I did that for quite some time. And even still, the performance of a public ritual is only a very small sliver of the work that a healer is doing to hold the space of a physical protest. And so everybody is doing something. And when we do our part well, I think that's what Principle 2 is referring to, when we do our part well. Now, there are people who are here to preserve what is, to protect what is, and to defend what is, who have creative capacity, who are artists, who are visualists, who have the capacity to be creative. And I would argue and say, well, if they are doing what they're meant to be doing, we definitely then need to be making sure we're doing what we need to. And so for me, in this concept of we need more response-able artists, or artists who are able to respond to who they are meant to be, and what they're supposed to be doing, along with what is happening in real time. And real time is vast, because I mean what's happening now, what's happening in the past, and what is likely to happen in the future if we continue this loop. So yeah, there's that. And I think that the culture aspect embodies the spiritual aspect, the emotional aspect. All of those things are things that need to be tended to as part of doing what you're supposed to be doing. Like, I have a friend right now who's been moving through different healing levels, and she was like, oh, you know what? I was focused on the emotional part, but then I had a physical, like my body started to change, and then I was only focusing on my body, and now I've got to figure out a way to do both, because I have to pay attention to both. And how much work that takes to expand your capacity to be able to do both and to do it well. And so I think the daydreaming practice touches on that like when you give yourself the time and space to really be in another world and to cultivate that strength, you receive things in return, like the capacity to do what it is you're supposed to be doing, even if it, isn't flashy, or even if it's particularly difficult or contentious, that like you will have what you need to do that.
So you've already referenced this, but you said in the third principle, ideas are agential. They have
Mm-hmm.
agency. Can you explain that?
Yes. I love this principle because it's true. Everything about it is true. Ideas are like little spirits, they come to you, they see if you have what they need to survive. You either do or you don't, and sometimes you don't right now, but you might have it later. But also, if you don't, they will find another person or another vessel or entry point to come into the world. Ideas do what they want to do. I think the word idea is a flattened explanation of what an idea actually is, like a fully packaged vision with everything you need in it to become a thing is included in this little gift box that comes floating into your mind or your heart or your elbow, and it comes in and you're like, oh my gosh, I just saw this whole thing. I have this story, I got this film, I got this idea, this project I want to start. You see it and it just comes out. And then, interestingly enough, the imagination, this colonial, what I'm identifying now as a colonial construct, would be like, oh, word, you see this project. So how are you going to do that? We don't have the money for that. And then all of a sudden, it's this conversation now where the imagination has taken the thing and sort of locked it in, and it becomes chained to the imagination. But like, our ideas are fully functioning outside of its relationship to our imaginations, so long as we, like I said earlier, follow the orders. The thing is, like, a lot of the times these ideas come to us and we are afraid of what it asks us to do. What it requires to do the thing is its own emotional process. This goes back to the previous point, the previous principle, that like we have to be able to respond to the ideas that we are calling forth about these new worlds. And we also have to be willing and able to forfeit the self we thought we were in order for something to come through. We have to be able to let ourselves go. And this idea of a self, the little package that we also became to survive the world. And so ideas are like these little sprites that are just everywhere all the time. Like they're so abundant. If you're tapped into those, some people see them all the time, some people don't. I have an overabundance of ideas to the point where I have to be like, is this actually for me to do? Or am I just like catching the wave that somebody's going to put this out? And a lot of the times, if I wait long enough, I'll be like, oh, this other person was absolutely supposed to do this, but I just caught the wave. And so honoring the agency of things that you cannot see but are present, I think starting with ideas is one of the ways that we can start to decenter the human narrative, but also to re personify or re inspirit the natural world with its personhood, to give it back, to say that, like, I can see a tree as a person now because I was able to see that my idea had agency. I'm able to see that there's no such thing as an object, you know? That through objectification, anything can be that, but like that everything inherently is a self. How do I greet my coffee mug in the morning as a self? These are things that can only happen when we start with something very like, oh, my idea. My idea is its own spirit. And when you build a relationship with an idea, you see that like it changes. Sometimes it doesn't like what you're doing and it'll let you know. And you might experience that as a block, but actually it's not. Sometimes it's like, you know what? I thought I wanted to be born in this world, but I poked my little head out and I don't want that. I'm going back in. It might not want to be manifested at all. And like the work is to honor that and to know that there are plenty more ideas that are going to be coming through the channel that is you.
Like you, this was also one of my favorite principles. And I have been experiencing a creative block for the past few weeks. I'm working on a romance series. I'm writing a sequel, my book two. And when I finished the first draft, it was shorter than I wanted it to be. And so I let it sit for like 6 months. I was like, I'll figure out how to expand it later. And I kept thinking about, how do I expand it? How do I make it bigger? How do I add this? How do I add that? And when I was looking at this idea, I was thinking about why I thought it needed to be bigger. And a lot of that had to do with traditional publishing. It had to do with capitalism and this idea that your book has to be a certain length to be complete, not because that's what's best for the story, but because that's what makes the most bang for your buck. And so when I sat down and I looked back at this idea, it was like, oh, this book is important because I need to do 4 things. I can do those 4 things in maybe 45,000 words. I can do them well. And so it's like, it does not need to be, maybe it's a novella. Maybe it's not an actual book. And so that was just like this huge realization for me. That's why I was like, I'm so thankful for
I'm
this.
so happy to hear that. I
I
love
figured it
that.
out.
I love that for you because you never know what the life cycle of an idea is supposed to be and how it will serve you. And how at some point you might put out a novella and that novella will be exactly what it needs to be to fit into some category that will get you this, that will get connected to you, you know, to this person or connect you to this organization. And had you written a novel, that may not be the reality. So it's like, wild to see an idea give back to you when you follow the orders. But it really does pay off in the end to just listen and do the thing. But we get stuck in it has to be this way. I do this every single time an idea comes to me. Like, we wrestle. It's not a smooth, like, oh, okay process. It's more of a process that's like, the idea is bucking up against me, and I think I have a creative block. And I have to be like, is this actually a block? What is a creative block? And that is a whole other episode. But like, and then having to be like, is this an actual block? And if it is, what is it asking of me right now? Clearly I need to slow down. Why? And then also, what are the external conditions that are feeding into this idea that I have a block right now? Is it actually a systemic barrier? Am I actually dealing with like insecurity, financial insecurity right now? Like, what are the things that are contributing to this feeling? And I learned that those are just very different things. But yes to the novella wanting to be exactly what it is. I love that for you. I love that you took a step back and you were able to hear it differently and say like, oh, what do you want to be? And I think that that'll pay off.
I feel like you addressed artists swim in a stream of ideas, which is the fifth principle. And you also talked about creative blocks are fundamental to any creative process. And a part of me feels like all of this can be in conversation with the fourth principle, which I think we could probably end on, which is we answer to the spirit of creation and not the other way
Yes.
around.
So we answer to the spirit of creation and not the other way around. Like, that principle was really founded on reciprocity with the spirit of creation. And I really love the question that you posed. Do you offer as much creativity to the world as you receive from spirit? What holds you back? And I had to really sit with those questions because I think that it's a lot that holds me back. Like, one, it is capitalism. It is this idea of selling my work, trying to quote unquote make a living from it. But in order to do that, I have to make sure it's like palatable, both me and my work. But what if the work doesn't want to be palatable? What do I do then? Like,
That's a big question.
I also think about like the fear of some random person like matching the worst parts of my inner critic and being like, oh, if they said it, it's true. Even if there are like 10 times as many people who say the opposite, who affirm and support me, I'm like, oh, this one person has to be right. So I think there's a lot that's holding us back. And I was just wondering if you just had anything else to add to that. We answer to the spirit of creation.
Well, first I want to say, yes, there is a lot that is holding us back. Some of it is within our control, some of it's not. Some of it's something we can see, some of it we can't. But to me, the concept of being held back is, I'm like, it's not even a factor at some point. You know what I mean? Like, when I find myself in a place of feeling held back, as I do right now in some very fundamental ways in a lot of creative projects. For example, ImaginationDoulas is expanding, and I feel held back by my own desire for complete control, and I know that I have to hand this over to other people. And so that's a real stumbling block for me right now, is that I have to give it away and let people think and feel and be with it in ways that are completely their own. And the fear of that is that my work will be stolen from me, like something will be taken from me. And I think that's an ancestral reaction. And so I think when you say like what gets in the way, and I'm like, it's a lot of things, like you said. And it's deep, and it's not just like even in capitalism and money is tied to something else. And so there's a lot of work to sort through. But I think when we get in the habit of answering only to spirit, and your spirit, being your own spirit, but also your supports, it doesn't erase those struggles. But when I'm able to reorient to say, I'm just following orders, like that's become its own affirmation for myself, to tell myself I'm just following orders, so that I'm not even getting wrapped up in the conversation within around money or reception, or whether or not people are going to like this, or people going to disagree and like, string me up and I'll be canceled or whatever that means. That like none of that even is a part of the conversation, because I'm just following orders. I'm just following the orders. And there's a quote I have right here, because I write at this desk, that says, on fear of criticism, there's a quote by Bayo Akomolafe, who is like a big brother to me, that says, no one stands upright or tall upon the world, we stand diagonally. And that frees me of trying to be upright, of like, I don't need to be saying everything correctly or having a perfectly, I don't know, shaped response or some public statement on anything. Like, I don't have to do that. Actually, I'm completely free of having to do that. I am accountable to evolve when information comes my way that's new. And so long as I'm open to that, I think even if the worst criticism came at me, if I can learn from it, I'm willing to do that, because I'm just following the orders. That's it. So it's taken the personal part out of my own creative process and allows for me to just follow the path, And I think that's what that principle really entails, is like, learn how to follow the path and keep that tunnel vision in that way, so that even if things come into it, it's all a part of, okay, I made a mistake and I'm just following the order, so let me integrate that lesson. Oh, I need to integrate that lesson, but I'm just going to keep this path. Following and answering the call of spirit of my spiritual supports has not led me astray at any point. I was telling Minda actually the other day, I was like, my ancestors have a better track record with me than I do with myself. So actually, I'm going to just give it to them and trust that they know what they're doing, and trust that as they show me how to be with me, I learn how to be with them. And so just follow the orders. What does the idea want to do? Follow those orders. What are your ancestors telling you to do? Follow those orders. Like, take the self completely out of it, because the self is attached to the imagination. And those two together can be, can make you your own worst enemy at times when, that's not necessary. And I'm speaking from personal experience on that, but I'm like, removing the self and the imagination has made a lot of things possible. And it's not a once and for all removal. I have to remove this. It's a choice every day to be like, okay, I'm just going to follow these orders. It's like, so I hope I hope that was clear. I think ultimately what ImaginationDoulas is trying to do is guide Black people and people who are blackened by society back to ancestral reverence practices. Like, that's what this is all about. To let an idea be agential is to train your mind in how to see the animacy around the world, to see the life and the beingness of other forces that are not human. All of this is about learning how to revere the ancestors.
Well, did you have any final thoughts, Leah, that you wanted to add before we end? Or
I just want to thank you, Austen, for showing up today, for sharing Imagination Doulas with us, for sharing like all of your like insight and for following orders basically. Because if you didn't, we wouldn't have this. So thank you.
I want to echo that and say thank you. The way you've expanded the way I'm thinking about daydreaming and imagination, and thinking about, like, I will say I love the idea of ideas as a spirit, because that kind of puts a lot into context about when I feel like I am bum rushed with like things and I just don't know like where I'm supposed to put it. So
Write
I
it all down.
appreciate it.
Write them all down. I have literally a laundry list of ideas, films, projects, short films, documentary. Like, I mean, I've never even written a documentary. And like, I'm like, why do y'all want me to be doing so much film? But what I found is that actually I'm going to be doing this later in my life. This is like a roadmap. It's not like a do it right now. It's like, oh, at some point in my 50s, 40s, I will be doing film. And that's it for a while. And
Mhm.
so I'm like, okay, help me order these. And then they're like, start here. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to start here and I'm going to focus on that thing until y'all tell me to go to the next one. But it's hard to get all the information up front. But that's what it is to see. Like, you just don't know the timing.
Mm-hmm.
But just so you, like, I don't know if it helps to know that, like, yeah, it doesn't have to be all right now.
No, I feel that. So if you like this episode, you can like, rate, and review Hoodoo Plant Mamas on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If anything from the show resonated with you, make sure to share with us on social media. You can find us on Twitter at Hoodoo Plants and Instagram at Hoodoo Plant Mamas. Thank y'all for listening and stay tuned for the next episode. Bye.
Bye.